As I was preparing for the Drash today, I thought about our children. Our children are in this congregation, and many other congregations are so brilliant. And I thought I'm going to be talking a little bit about Moses and our faith and our trust. And I thought that I would contact our young people and ask them a couple questions and ask them if they would return their answers to me, which they did, and they're absolutely wonderful. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to give you the direction or the question that I asked them, and I'm going to give you what answers they gave me. And then as we go through my drash, you'll see that all their answers are true and right on. My question to them was, why did God choose the route through the wilderness when there seemed to be a much more direct way to go? Now, here's your answers. You can try to figure out which child gave me what, but here's the answers. It was possibly a test of faith or trust. Number 2, it may have been for protection to avoid certain enemies. Because God wanted them to follow his way and not the way they wanted to go. Because sometimes the short path is the bad path of the sin path. That was good. Because that is the way God wanted them to go. Because they needed to follow God's instructions to go into the promised land. Right? And the last, to test their faith in him and prolong the journey to make sure the previous generation that had sinned against him had all died out and the next generation had fear, respect, and faith for him. Good answers? I think they were wonderful answers. All right, so the title of my drash today is Learning to Trust Adonai. Have you ever stopped and wondered why Adonai took the Israelites on the journey through the wilderness? It seems like a crooked and winding path that could have been much shorter. When looking at it on a map, it looks like a trail of a hunting dog on the scent of a rabbit. They were everywhere. Stop and think what it would be like to wander around the desert for 40 years, while knowing that the entire trip could have been completed in about a week. Just like the Israelites, I would probably have been very frustrated too. One thing I've learned over the last several years is that God shows his power in our lives through our obedience. Every direction change in the wilderness was guided by the God of Israel. Moses was just following his directions. The Israelites needed to learn from their journey. Let's talk a little about these things. Number 1, the shortest route would have taken the Israelites through hostile Philistine country. The Israelites were not ready to meet such a violent enemy. Exodus 13:17 through 18 said, the Israelites that left Egypt were broken souls. They had been slaves for 8 to 10 generations. They were not in any condition to undertake such a challenge. Number 2, God wanted the Egyptians to know that he is Lord. Yes, God had a covenant responsibility to bring the Jewish people out of Egypt, but he was also concerned about the spiritual condition of the Egyptians. He said in Exodus 14:4, I will make Pharaoh so hard-hearted that he will pursue them. Thus, I will win glory for myself at the expense of Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will realize at last that I am Adonai. Now, here's something to ponder. When God takes us the long way, he may have had salvation of others on his mind. Number 3, God planned to show his people his might one more time. How did he do that? Through the parting of the Red Sea and the destruction of Pharaoh and his army. They could no longer drag the children of God back into slavery. They were free to worship and serve their deliverer. To bring that back to us today, God sometimes brings us through Red Sea experiences so that we will have a deep and lasting revelation of just how free we are in the Messiah. John 8:32 says, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Number 4, God wanted his children to know that there is no turning back. The Red Sea had been sealed off. The road back had been sealed. They no longer had access to the food and delicacies of Egypt. Numbers 11:5 says, "We remember the fish we ate at Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and garlic." The Israelites grumbled and complained a lot. They kept looking back. They were looking at their past enslavement through rose-colored glasses. They desperately needed to have an encounter with God, to receive his instructions for their new life and how to follow God through his written words. When believers are brought into a place of a new life in the Messiah, but are not yet living as a new creation, they need to learn to depend on the Lord daily and resist temptation to fondly reminisce about former lives lived in sin. God sometimes brings us through Red Sea experiences so that we will not turn back to our lives enslaved to the forces of the world. Number 5, God took the Israelites on the long way because he had great plans for them. He had plans to transform them into a holy nation by giving them his word in the form of the tablets of the 10 Commandments, written by his own hand. He was giving them a civil and spiritual society by giving them the Torah. He wanted to recreate the slaves into free men and women that would know how to fight for the possession of the promised land. In our wilderness, away from the distractions and noise of the short way, we often are more attentive to the voice of the Lord. It is in this place that we have an opportunity to prepare for a transformation, a new beginning. Number 6, God wanted to demonstrate to the Israelites that he could sustain them even in the wilderness. He supplied them with water from a rock, manna from heaven, and even meat in the form of flocks of birds. God also wants us to rely on him so that he would supernaturally demonstrate to us he's our provider, even in the toughest times. In Numbers 7, God wanted a people who would trust in his leading. The Bible reveals that the Hebrew people, even after seeing everything God had done for them, balked at entering the land that he had promised them. Out of the 12 spies, only Joshua and Caleb brought back a positive report. Joshua agreed with Caleb, who confidently proclaimed, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." Because of the disobedience of the generation that God had led out of Egypt, only Joshua and Caleb were allowed to enter the promised land from that generation. We too are engaging in battles along our journey, growing in wisdom and improving our strategies as we shed worldly thinking. Learn from God's word and boldly progress toward God's promises and blessings. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.